And from what perspective, joining us is a human rights activist, Evon Idahosa. Welcome, Evon. What do you make of the AU's announcement to create an organization to help coordinate national migration policies and improve relations with foreign partners? Is that the answer to Africa's migration crisis?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. I think it's important that we really, unravel what the impetus is for the AU's decision, right? Is it tied to development aid that's been promised by the European Union, or is this a genuine effort that really prioritizes people over profits, right? Because what we have in Africa, unfortunately, is not the reality that people are the priority. We need leaders who are going to think progressively, who are going to have vision that inspires hope, particularly in our youth, who are the ones who are making this mass exodus from Africa. We need people who are thinking ahead of an Africa that will be impacted by climate change and the resulting migration, the unsustainable population growth. These are the sort of leaders that we need, and these are the sort of things that they need to start thinking about. But unfortunately, that's not the reality. And so I don't think this effort by the African Union, if it's not based in addressing the economic crisis and addressing corruption, which is really resulting in the poverty that's killing a lot of our people and forcing a lot of our youth out of their countries. If it's not based on resolving all of those issues, it's not going to make a difference, unfortunately.
All the realities, and then over 1,000 people dying while sailing from Libya to Europe so far this year. Despite the numbers, EU countries are increasingly turning their backs on migrants as well. What could be responsible for the sentiment?
Well, I think what's happening in Europe today is that we know that the numbers of the migrant flows have decreased to pre-2015 levels. In 2015, we know there were over 1 million people that migrated into Europe, but the numbers are certainly low. And so what you've got now is a political crisis that's really based on a lot of the unfortunate burden, the reality that countries like Italy and Germany have had to carry. Italy and Greece, I apologize, have had to carry because they're the ones who have taken on the most migrants since 2014. So I think that that's the underlying issue. There's also issues of fear of the other, the fear of the unknown, bringing people from a different culture who believe in different traditions, religions into the country, and so that's created a lot of sentiment of frustration within people in Europe as well. I mean, there was a poll in May of this year where 72% of Europeans are asking the EU to do more on the migration crisis. But the reality is that there is some genuine concern. I mean, I can understand because a lot of Africans who are coming into Europe are really uninformed about the reality that as economic migrants, which is what the majority of them are, you're not going to be granted asylum. So, for example, Nigerians in 75% of Nigerian asylum applications, they're denied, and so the reality is that these people get to Europe, most of them are unskilled, unfortunately, and are not able to work. And so they then become, quote unquote, a burden on European society. And so I think all of that coupled together is really what's resulted in the increase in the anti-migrant sentiment.
Finally, Evon, the International Organization for Migration says smugglers are exploiting migrants desperate to get to the EU, especially before it tightens its borders. Is there anything else that can be put in place to curb this? This also goes to countries like Nigeria that's battling human trafficking as well.
Right. I mean, the reality is that until most of these African countries address our economic problems, you're going to see continued flows. Europe has been both, in my opinion, somewhat complicit and complacent in the European migrant crisis by making agreements with Libya that have essentially resulted in people being treated as slaves and being forced into dehumanizing servitude in Libya. And so, I mean, I think a lot of it has to come back to really looking at the humanizing of each other and putting policies in place that are going to prioritize people over a crisis.
All right, always a pleasure. Evon Idahosa, human rights activist, thank you for joining us on the program.